Hey, Pastor Steve Waldron here today. Hope you're having a great day in Jesus. We're going to look at the New King James Version of the Bible today. Now, the New King James Version claims to be and tried to be the fifth major revision of the King James. You know, you had one in 1629, 1638, 1762, 1769, and then they wanted the New King James to be the next major revision. But I think almost all sides recognize that they really went beyond the scope of just minor emendational changes and updating some anachronisms. And in many cases, they actually made it more difficult to read, like terebinth instead of oak in Isaiah, and palanquin instead of chariot of wood in Song of Solomon 3:9, and several places like that. They just made it more difficult to read. But let's look at what the New King James is. Arthur Farstad, who was pretty much a majority text Textus Receptus guy, he's actually the editor of the majority text, one of them that you use, really wanted this. And so it was inaugurated in 1975, 2 meetings, 130 biblical scholars in Nashville and Chicago. And they prepared the guidelines. I know N.A. Urshan was one of the guys that was on the North American Committee, interestingly enough. And so they wanted to preserve the style of the 1611 King James. And so the text base was the Textus Receptus, Byzantine text type, even though there are some differences between that and the King James. And in the Old Testament was the Masoretic text with Septuagint influence. They claimed that their translational method was formal equivalence as opposed to dynamic equivalence, which is more of a word for word, but not necessarily slavishly just following the originals and the so-called originals. According to the preface of the New King James, it uses the 6777 edition of the Stuttgart Biblia Hebraica for the Old Testament, with frequent comparisons made to the Ben Hayim edition of the Bomberg text of 24 and 25, 1524 and 1525. So you can already see there's a difference there. They did use a different textual base in the Old Testament. And then both the Old Testament text and the King James and the King James come from the Ben Hayim text known as that. But the 6777 edition of Stuttgart uses the Leningrad manuscript B19A, and it uses the received text. Now, one thing that it has caught a lot of flack for is it does give Alexandrian readings down at the bottom. And a lot of people have said this tends to confusion, because you read and then at the bottom it'll say the NA, which is Nestle's Island, reads something else. And actually as well, for many years, just like the ESV, the New King James was a translation in flux. The NIV is that way. Many modern translations are translations in flux. And I can appreciate them trying to perfect things. The King James did that in a sense as well, but most of theirs was done just because of the antiquated printing methods. And so one of the major things that the New King James did is that they dedicated it to the pre-Christian Trinity, according to their own words. And they used the triquarta, which was a symbol of the pre-Christian Trinity, that they dedicated this to. I've got many New King James versions that say that in the front. And even Trinitarian scholars have said in the translation process that they divide the members of the Godhead too much. They divide the members of the so-called Trinity too much. And so you see that in their elimination of the these and the thous, and went to all you. Well, the these and the thous in the King James Version, they weren't just Elizabethan English, they were singular. They were a carrying over from the Hebrew and Greek, whether you're talking to one person or a multiplicity of persons. Whereas in the New King James, you totally lose that. So right off the get-go, in many thousands of places, you lose accuracy of translation. And so there's many, many differences. I would consider the New King James Version an inferior translation to the King James Version. Now, many people kind of scorningly say, which King James? Do you mean the Nelson King James, the Zondervan King James, the Cambridge King James, the Oxford King James? The answer to that is any of those King James aforementioned are infinitely better than the New King James Version. So the New King James, I've known people just absolutely could not, for whatever reason, wrap their mind around the King James. Maybe they weren't praying enough or something. Use the New King James to get the gist. But you got to be careful, because there'll even be some differences in meaning at times in there, like 1 Thessalonians 5:22, like 1 Timothy 6:10, such as that it actually means something different. Genesis 1:1, Acts 2:38. Reads different. It really weakens Acts 2:38. So anyhow, I pray you just read the King James, but this is just a look at the New King James Version of the Bible, where it came from, and well-meaning people there at Thomas Nelson. Love those guys at Thomas Nelson. They really wanted to do the right thing, and in so many instances, but I think they missed their goal. They missed the mark. But God bless you. We love you. Just keep reading the Scripture.